Before anyone could react, Mary Jane Watson, eyes blazing, grabbed a book from her desk and hurled it at Harry Osborn. Harry Osborn ducked just in time. The book slammed against the wall behind him with a loud thud and fell to the floor. He shrugged, resigned to his fate. This girl's wrath was terrifying, but he stood his ground. Mary Jane Watson's fury still simmered. Her chest heaved as she glared at Harry Osborn, looking ready to tear him limb from limb. After a mental struggle, she finally gave up, snorted coldly, gritted her teeth, and turned her head away, ignoring him, seemingly deciding to drop the niceties. In a blink, the entire class was stunned, gawking at the shabbily dressed student at the door, speechless. Teachers were practically untouchable deities in their minds, especially Mary Jane Watson, the school's most talented and perfect young teacher. Insulting her was unthinkable. She was, after all, the idol and goddess of countless students. Yet this bastard, in the very first class meeting, had provoked the teacher goddess to the point of fury, yet he still stood brazenly on the podium, not thrown out the window by security or Mary Jane Watson herself. It was a miracle. Moreover, the words he'd whispered to Mary Jane Watson, though unheard by the class, were clearly suggestive, even to the dimmest wit. This guy was definitely a dog with horns, a real piece of work. Provocation. This was absolute provocation. Utterly astonished, the students stared at this audacious individual who dared to provoke Mary Jane Watson, wildly speculating about his identity. After all, someone who dared to provoke Ms. Watson, who held absolute authority in the students' eyes, right in the classroom, and still remained unscathed, not drawn and quartered, was either insane or a demon. Mary Jane Watson seethed, feeling her lungs about to burst. It wasn't because she couldn't retaliate against this bastard's provocation in front of the students, but because she realized he wasn't someone to be trifled with, certainly not someone she, Mary Jane Watson, could afford to offend. But the memory of his whispered words, uttered in front of everyone, ignited a fresh wave of fury within her. Shameless. This absolute scoundrel had the audacity to approach her and whisper, writing a self-criticism. Fine. We can go all the way at my place tonight, deal with you, then write it together. How could she not understand what he meant by deal with you? In that instant, she felt defeated. Based on her brief interaction with Harry Osborn, she fully believed he was capable of such a thing. If that happened, she'd be beyond tears, beyond even wanting to die. So, Mary Jane Watson had no choice but to endure. Just then, the bell rang. Mary Jane Watson instinctively checked the time. Although it was only 10:30, she quickly announced the end of the class meeting, leaving the remaining time for self-study and review. A clamor erupted in the classroom, followed by whispers and gossip, all focused on the one who dared to publicly offend the teacher, occasionally pointing and muttering in Harry Osborn's direction. Chapter 33, Son-in-law Harry Osborn, unfazed, maintained a slight smile, hunching his shoulders and tucking his head slightly, standing still. Mary Jane Watson's punishment was for him to stand all morning, and he always obeyed teachers. He considered himself a good student, as long as this woman didn't provoke him. Beside him, Eddie Brock was a blubbering mess, face still flushed, making Harry Osborn curious. He hadn't expected this lecherous bastard to be so thin-skinned. In Harry's mind, someone who could fail university entrance exams for 7 years should have skin as thick as iron, impervious to swords and spears. Brother Harry. Eddie Brock, unable to contain himself any longer, tugged at Harry Osborn's sleeve while Mary Jane Watson organized teaching materials on the podium. What did you say to Ms. Lamb just now? Why is she so furious? You really want to know? Harry Osborn turned, touching his nose and looking at him meaningfully. Lowering his voice, he said, if I tell you, you write my apology letter. Nah, I'd rather not know. Eddie Brock promptly shut his mouth. Mary Jane Watson, having gathered her materials, stormed out of the classroom, fuming. Passing Harry Osborn, she let out a cold huff, paused, and said curtly, you two better stay put this morning. I'll be back for a surprise inspection. If I catch you sneaking off, humph. The threat hung in the air. Glaring at the still smiling Harry Osborn, she strode out. Just then, a moderately built young man hurried to the classroom door. Another teacher, seemingly in his late 20s, he wore a fitted black suit and a buzz cut. His stern expression, as if someone owed him millions, made him seem unapproachable. The young teacher quickly blocked the doorway, stopping Mary Jane Watson. Hesitantly, he called out, "Ms. Lamb. Mr. Jiang, is something the matter?" Mary Jane Watson's face showed a flicker of uncertainty as she asked softly. "The principal asked me to tell you, to go to his office." "You and Harry Osborn," the young teacher said, hesitating slightly but maintaining a serious tone. "Huh?" Mary Jane Watson's expression shifted to one of astonishment. Turning to stare incredulously at Harry Osborn, who was still standing by the podium, she exclaimed in surprise. The classroom erupted in chatter. The students, privy to the exchange, turned their gazes towards Harry Osborn, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and schadenfreude. Now they finally understood, any student who crossed Mary Jane Watson was absolutely deserving of divine retribution. They deserved their comeuppance. It wasn't that there wouldn't be consequences, but that the time hadn't come yet. Well, wasn't it coming now? After all, those personally summoned by the headmaster never met a good end. Even Eddie Brock looked up at Harry Osborn beside him with a worried expression, winking repeatedly and muttering, "Harry, bro, be humble later, say nice things, try not to get disciplined." Harry Osborn, meanwhile, was also astonished, staring speechless at the young teacher at the door. Damn, his luck was truly rotten. Just a little provocation of the teacher, and it had reached the headmaster's ears so quickly. Besides, Mary Jane Watson was his fiancée. Provoking one's fiancée wasn't illegal, at least not against school rules. Damn, were there school rules against teasing your fiancée? Turning to look at Mary Jane Watson, he found the woman's expression uncertain, her chest rising and falling. After a long while, she finally nodded reluctantly to the teacher. "Mr. Jiang, do you know why the headmaster wants to see me?" "I guess it's mostly related to your cousin, Harry Osborn." Mr. Jiang hesitated slightly but whispered, glancing at Harry Osborn standing by the podium, a subtle, knowing look appearing on his serious face. "I understand. I'll be right there." Mary Jane Watson's face darkened, but she still nodded. Then she turned and glared at Harry Osborn. "What are you still standing there for? Let's go. You're quite the celebrity, getting a personal summons from the headmaster on your first day." With that, she snorted coldly and turned to leave. Harry Osborn felt a wave of headache and helplessness, looking disgruntledly at the woman fuming like a tigress. After hesitating, he finally trudged along, head down, following her. Bloody hell, the old headmaster himself came to the door. "What does this have to do with me? This woman's taking it out on me, it's just unreasonable." The headmaster's office was, of course, located in the administrative building at the heart of the campus. This 19-story building, constructed with imposing grandeur, had exquisite and luxurious interiors. Unexpectedly, the school's senior management was so corrupt, Harry Osborn thought, hunching slightly as he stood before the administrative building, filled with disdain. But he was even more curious about the headmaster's identity, name, gender, and why he had suddenly summoned him, along with Mary Jane Watson. Could it be that Mary Jane Watson was truly untouchable at this school, wielding absolute power? He had only taken a little revenge for her arrogance and smugness, and she'd run off to the headmaster to tattle, wanting him disciplined or even expelled. But if that were truly the case, Harry Osborn would be thanking his lucky stars, pondering whether he should buy 2 cartons of fine cigarettes and 2 bottles of top-shelf liquor as a thank you to the principal for expelling him. On second thought, something felt off. Mary Jane Watson's anger and frustration upon receiving the news hadn't seemed feigned. If she had snitched and gotten him expelled, she'd at least have a smug look of triumph. Confused, Harry Osborn scratched his head and hurried into the administration building. Mary Jane Watson, still fuming, stalked ahead, pointedly ignoring him, her face an icy mask, though occasional huffs of anger escaped her. Harry Osborn would later learn that his own father had funded the 19-story administration building a few years prior, ostensibly as a contribution to the nation's education, but really just a few tens of millions of yuan for the title of philanthropic entrepreneur. Not only the university's leadership, but also associate professors and above, along with the management of various colleges, worked in this building. Mary Jane Watson's office was on the 15th floor, while the principal's was on the 12th, presumably the domain of principals and vice-principals. Trailing Mary Jane Watson, Harry Osborn knocked on the principal's door and entered, only to be taken aback. The principal's office was impressively decorated, exuding an air of understated luxury. Red sandalwood furniture, a formal sofa and tea table set with a delicate tea service, and facing the main door, a majestic painting of Along the River during the Qingming festival. Beside it, bookshelves overflowed with encyclopedias and classics like the Tao Te Ching and Classic of Mountains and Seas. Behind the genuine leather desk sat a portly, middle-aged man of about 50. His receding hairline, with a few wisps of straw-like hair clinging to his scalp, gave him a comical, almost pathetic appearance. This must be the big cheese, Harry Osborn thought, surprised that the head of Tianfu University, a top-3 university in the country, was just a middle-aged man. He'd imagined a wizened old scholar, a renowned academic authority with strong leadership skills. Even stranger, the principal looked familiar, like someone Harry had met before. He racked his brain, but couldn't place him. 4 or 5 middle-aged teachers, likely deans or department heads, stood before the principal's desk, looking like they were being dressed down for some transgression. Despite the principal's comical appearance, his expression was anything but laughable. Stern as a brick, his voice boomed with reprimands, while the deans standing before him, faces crimson, exchanged glances, not daring to utter a word. This principal's authority is undeniable, Harry Osborn thought, a sudden tension gripping him. He's definitely not someone to cross. What could he possibly want with me? Glancing at Mary Jane Watson beside him, he saw her face was still pale, her mood clearly foul. Yet, she occasionally glanced his way, a barely audible huff escaping her. Just then, the principal noticed Mary Jane Watson and Harry Osborn at the door. His tone softened slightly as he gave a few more instructions before dismissing the others. The 50-something deans' faces regained some color. Heads bowed like scolded children, they shuffled out of the office. Passing Mary Jane Watson, each offered a slight nod of greeting, then cast surprised looks at Harry Osborn before disappearing through the doorway. As the door clicked shut, Harry Osborn looked up at the still stern principal, his heart pounding. Damn, he thought, this doesn't look good. Today might be a disaster. Expulsion for offending Mary Jane Watson wouldn't be the end of the world, he mused, but a black mark on my record or a public reprimand would be mortifying. Just as Harry Osborn's thoughts drifted, the next scene nearly sent him sprawling to the floor in a dead faint. With the office door firmly closed, Mary Jane Watson suddenly called out, in a voice laced with conflicting emotions, "Dad." Harry Osborn froze, turning to the woman beside him, his mind a blank. Damn, he thought, she just called the principal, Dad. Does that mean this imposing principal is, my future father-in-law? Utterly stunned, he stared blankly, speechless. The following scene nearly choked him on his own saliva. Veins bulging on his forehead, he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The principal glanced at Mary Jane Watson, then snorted, his face hardening. But in a flash, a beaming smile replaced the frown. He shot out of his leather chair and rushed towards Harry Osborn, grabbing his hand and excitedly exclaiming, "My dear boy." Harry Osborn, completely dumbfounded, stared at the portly man before him. He looked more like a moneybags than a distinguished university principal, devoid of any academic grace. This guy's a chameleon, Harry thought, speechless. One minute he's a raging tyrant, the next he's all smiles. Harry Osborn had only met his future father-in-law, John Watson, once, 20 years prior. He'd only heard his own father mention him, describing him as a leading figure in national education, a member of the Academy of Sciences, a recipient of national grants. Never in his wildest dreams had he imagined this esteemed father-in-law was the principal of Tianfu University. No wonder Mary Jane Watson had paled when she heard the principal had summoned them. At this moment, however, Harry Osborn glared at the old man, still unable to accept this reality. He felt the radiant smile on the old fox's face was a bit too enthusiastic, as if he had some shady secret affair with him if others didn't know better, sending a shiver down his spine. Moreover, what he couldn't understand was how this old man, with his potbelly, bald head, and eyes crinkled into slits from smiling, could have sired such a beautiful daughter like Mary Jane Watson. It seemed the saying ugly tree bears good fruit held some truth. Son-in-law. Just then, John Watson called out in a daze, finally interrupting Harry Osborn's train of thought. What's wrong? Are you surprised? Didn't old man Osborn tell you I'm the principal? Dad. However, at this moment, Mary Jane Watson finally couldn't hold back any longer, calling out listlessly. Seeing her father being so affectionate with that jerk, her face darkened even more. Shut up. I'll deal with you later. John Watson's expression immediately changed, and he roared sternly. Mary Jane Watson finally closed her mouth and said nothing more. But she glared angrily at the jerk whose hands were being tightly grasped by her father, her face full of resentment, and a cold snort escaped her nose. How could she not know why her father had summoned them both today? Wasn't it to defend her precious fiancée? Without her father's backing, this jerk would bully her every day. With her father on his side, wouldn't this jerk become even more arrogant and complacent? If it were any other student, being summoned and treated so warmly by the principal would have made them overjoyed. But this guy, he had the nerve to pout with a disgruntled expression. Thinking about the outrageous things this jerk had done to her in the past 2 days, a surge of anger welled up in Mary Jane Watson's heart. Oh, so it's Uncle Lamb. At this moment, Harry Osborn finally suppressed the shock in his heart, and a radiant smile immediately appeared on his face, even brighter than John Watson's foxy grin. He called out clearly, I didn't expect that after 20 years, Uncle Lamb is still as dashing and elegant as ever, with the same demeanor as back then. But by the end of it, even he felt his internal organs churning, almost vomiting on the spot. Ha! Unfazed by Harry Osborn's blatant flattery, John Watson readily accepted it, the smile on his face widening as he let out a hearty laugh. My son-in-law is quite the smooth talker. I never expected that after 20 years, you'd become so handsome and accomplished. It seems this is our Mary Jane's good fortune. Pfft. In that instant, Mary Jane Watson, who had been standing beside them, wanting to explode but unable to get a word in, finally couldn't hold back any longer. She almost choked on her own saliva, staring wide-eyed at the two men, one old and one young, shamelessly flattering each other. She was utterly speechless. If this jerk could be considered refined, talented, and successful at a young age, then any random thug off the street could be considered a pillar of the nation. This time, John Watson completely ignored her, quickly pulling Harry Osborn down onto the sofa in the middle of the office. He then retrieved a box of premium tea, seemingly a gift from someone, from a drawer, brewed a pot, and sat down opposite Harry. He then barked at Mary Jane Watson, telling her to sit next to Harry, his eyes narrowing to slits. Just like a father-in-law looking at his son-in-law, the more he looked, the more satisfied he became. Uncle John. Harry Osborn finally couldn't stand it anymore. Feeling like he was being stared at by a lecherous old man, his whole body felt uncomfortable. He broke the silence, calling out, I don't know why Uncle John called me here today, what is it all about? Nothing. Nothing at all. John Watson beamed his usual radiant smile, his plump face flushed. Yesterday, I was at a meeting in the province, so I didn't have time to visit my dear son-in-law. Today, I called you here mainly because I wanted to see you. After all, we'll be family soon. I don't know if you're used to the school, or used to being around Mary Jane. If you need anything, just tell me. Very good. Very good. Harry Osborn really couldn't stand the enthusiasm of his future father-in-law, and nodded hastily. Despite saying so, he still cooperated with a bright smile, displaying unprecedented politeness and humility. Fake. In a flash, Mary Jane Watson, who had been sitting silently with an icy face, finally couldn't hold it in any longer. She turned her head to look at the bastard beside her, who was greedy for money, completely different from the despicable and shameless image he had before when facing her. Instead, he had transformed into a polite and elegant young man. She immediately felt a wave of anger in her heart. She coldly snorted. She couldn't help but reach out and fiercely pinched the soft flesh on his waist. But Harry Osborn seemed to have his entire nervous system paralyzed, stiffening without a groan. Turning back, he still wore a bright smile, with a hint of deeper meaning, even a touch of affection as he looked at her. Very seriously, he said, "Uncle John, rest assured, Mary Jane is very good to me, right, Mary Jane?" "You." In that instant, Mary Jane Watson completely lost it. Her face turned livid as she glared at this bastard, speechless. After a long pause, she finally spat out, "Please call me Teacher Lamb, I am your teacher." "What's with your tone? Using that teacher voice of yours again?" Before she could finish, John Watson's face darkened, and he began to scold her sternly. "Don't forget, Harry is your fiancé. Your Uncle Osborn and I decided to let him come to school and stay with you because you two haven't seen each other for 20 years. It's to help you understand each other better, deepen your feelings, so that getting married later won't be too abrupt. It's not for Harry to actually study. I know perfectly well that Harry got his economics doctorate from Harvard 2 years ago." "Dad!" Mary Jane Watson said listlessly, exasperated. "If I ever see you putting on that teacher act in front of Harry again, humph." John Watson snorted coldly, scolding sternly, "A daughter should be obedient and virtuous to her husband, gentle and kind. Look at you. I've spoiled you for over 20 years, and this is the attitude you've developed. Don't think I don't know you made Harry stand at the blackboard earlier. I'll deal with you later. I'm in a good mood today." Mary Jane Watson was speechless with indignation, her lips pressed so tightly together she looked ready to cry. Turning to glare at the jerk beside her, she saw Harry Osborn looking back, a sly, fox-like grin on his face, as if he'd just pulled off a brilliant scheme and his tail was about to wag itself off. Mary Jane Watson gritted her teeth, chest heaving, but in front of her father, she didn't dare explode. She turned her head away, refusing to even look at the louse, determined to ignore him completely. "Harry, my dear boy, you've embarrassed her." John Watson chuckled awkwardly. "Mary Jane has been spoiled since she was a little girl. She's got a stubborn streak, so I hope you can be tolerant of her." "Absolutely. Absolutely." Harry Osborn maintained the refined air of an outstanding young man, nodding vigorously in agreement. Inwardly, he sneered at the old man. Stubborn? The girl was a firecracker, a wild Mustang waiting to be broken. That puts my mind at ease. John Watson finally breathed a sigh of relief. Ah, now I understand. Raising a daughter is nothing compared to finding a good son-in-law. Harry Osborn, momentarily speechless, clamped his mouth shut, pulled a cigarette from his breast pocket, offered it to John Watson, then lit it for him and took a deep drag himself. John Watson eagerly accepted the cigarette, his face beaming, and quickly lit it with his own lighter. His eyes crinkled into slits as he mimicked Harry Osborn, taking a deep drag and sighing contentedly. "Dad, your health isn't good. You shouldn't smoke." Mary Jane Watson couldn't hold back any longer, her voice laced with worry. "Nonsense. Today I'm happy, and this is a cigarette from my future son-in-law. How can I refuse? John Watson replied sternly. And you shouldn't smoke either. Don't forget you're still a student. Mary Jane Watson, unable to argue with her father, redirected her frustration at Harry Osborn. Ahem, before she could finish, John Watson's face darkened. He coughed pointedly, glaring at his daughter. Defeated, Mary Jane Watson closed her mouth. I really think you need to adjust your attitude. I've told you, Harry may be your student now in name, but he's also your fiancé. John Watson wasn't about to let his daughter off the hook. He looked at her with disappointment. You two should take this opportunity to cultivate your relationship. After all, you'll be getting married and having children. I'm getting old, and I'm waiting for grandchildren. Dad, Mary Jane Watson's face flushed crimson. Her voice trembled as she spoke, her eyes betraying her helplessness. I told you, I won't marry him. He's just my student, she blurted out defiantly. Nonsense. John Watson roared, slamming his hand on the table. He glared at her, cutting her off. Harry is such an outstanding young man. What's wrong with him? Besides, this was decided between me and old man Osborn. Do you want me to be a dishonest man and break my word? Dad, Mary Jane Watson's face paled, tears welling in her eyes, but she stubbornly repeated the word. Seeing her father's fury, she finally fell silent, biting her lower lip. Shut it. If I hear you say that again, don't blame me for not giving you another year to think it over. I'll have you two married immediately. But just then, a classic wicked grin spread across Harry Osborn's face as he casually reached behind him and wrapped an arm around her waist. Get off. Mary Jane Watson's body stiffened abruptly. She whipped her head around, her face a mask of fury as she glared at him, gritting her teeth. But Harry Osborn, still holding her close, leaned in, his breath ghosting her ear. If you don't want us forced to get married right now, he murmured, you'd better play along. Mary Jane Watson felt his warm breath on her ear, tinged with the scent of tobacco. A blush crept up her cheeks as she hesitated, looking at him with a mixture of suspicion and uncertainty. Finally, she didn't dare to move. Uncle John, Mary Jane isn't really like you think. She's mostly good to me, and we're working on things, but we need time, Harry Osborn said, finally breathing a sigh of relief, turning to address John Watson with a serious expression. Hearing you say that puts my mind at ease. John Watson said, his face relaxing into a pleased smile as he observed their intimate posture. Then, he shot a disapproving look at Mary Jane Watson. Look how understanding Harry is. I just don't get it. How can you even think of letting go of such an outstanding young man? Arg. Mary Jane Watson had had enough. With a shriek of frustration, she slapped away the jerk's hand from her waist and shot up from the sofa, her face pale, her small fists clenched as if she were about to punch someone. Cheeks puffed out in anger, she stormed out of the office. She had no doubt that if she stayed a moment longer, she'd cough up blood and die. She saw right through him. That little weasel was just trying to cop a feel, making up some noble excuse about needing her cooperation. And the most ridiculous part? Her dad actually bought it, practically treating him like his son-in-law already. Be nicer to Harry from now on. If I find out you're using your teacher status to bully him in class, don't expect me to be lenient. John Watson yelled after Mary Jane Watson's retreating figure. Then, turning back to Harry Osborn with an awkward laugh, he said, Ah, Harry, don't mind her. Mary Jane can be a bit headstrong sometimes, but she's got a good heart. You'll have to be patient with her. It's fine. It's fine. With Mary Jane Watson gone, Harry Osborn had no desire to stay and chat with the old fox. He got up and trailed after her. If you find class boring, just skip it. Come hang out in my office. I'll get someone to bring us some good tea, and we can chat, John Watson rambled on invitingly. If Mary Jane gives you any trouble as your teacher, just let me know, and I'll deal with that ungrateful girl. I really shouldn't have agreed with old Osborne to have you enrolled as a student. I should have made you a teacher here." Harry Osborne fell silent for a moment, but didn't add anything further, hurriedly opening the office door and rushing out. Yet, as he stepped out of the principal's office, he saw Mary Jane Watson standing stiffly in the hallway, seemingly waiting for him. Her eyes were fixed on him, face pale, and her gaze could have melted steel. Stared down by this woman, Harry Osborne felt momentarily powerless, but still he walked towards her in a daze. Touching his nose, he gave a goofy grin, stammered for a long while, and finally managed, "My future father-in-law seems to have a bit of a flair for the dramatic, doesn't he?" "Who's your future father-in-law?" Mary Jane Watson's face flushed crimson. She gritted her teeth, then seemed to remember something, her teeth grinding even harder. "You intentionally groped me just now, didn't you? Your filthy hands dared to touch me. You think I'd intentionally take advantage of you, and at a time like this? Do you really think I lack opportunities?" Harry Osborne felt utterly helpless. He glanced at her with disdain. "Didn't you see? If you'd kept arguing with your father, he would have forced us to marry right then and there, believe it or not. That's—" Mary Jane Watson's expression finally softened slightly. Knowing her father, he was indeed capable of such a thing. But she seemed unwilling to show weakness in front of this man. She sniffed and huffed, "But you didn't have to get handsy. To make your father believe us, don't you think we needed to make it a bit convincing?" Harry Osborne was getting a headache. Jerk. Mary Jane Watson couldn't help but curse, but her voice suddenly turned serious. "Regardless of what you think about this engagement, I need to tell you today that no matter what, I will not agree to it. I never thought I'd end up marrying you either. Some say marriage is a tomb. I'm not ready to die just yet." Harry Osborne's expression remained unchanged as he touched his nose and replied casually. "Do you really mean that?" Mary Jane Watson's expression shifted slightly, as if surprised. She tilted her head and asked in a low voice. "Don't you think it's absurd to bind two living people together based on a promise made 20 years ago?" A bitter expression crossed Harry Osborne's face. He shook his head and spoke softly. "That's for the best. I'm relieved to hear you say that." Mary Jane Watson's face suddenly paled. She gritted her teeth, sniffed, and turned towards the stairs. Harry Osborne just chuckled softly and followed her. He was a bit surprised by her sudden change in demeanor. Her face had become drawn, and her temper seemed unusually short. He couldn't help but call out, "Hey, where are you going?" "None of your business. You're overstepping." Mary Jane Watson didn't even turn around, replying coldly. She didn't stop, though, angrily continuing towards the stairs. The sharp clicks of her heels against the floor echoed heavily. Harry Osborne, startled by her outburst, stared at her retreating back, baffled by this sudden eruption of fury. Bloody hell, women are truly unfathomable creatures, he thought. Despite his bewilderment, he rubbed his nose and followed her. "Why are you following me?" Mary Jane Watson, still fuming, whirled around, glaring at him. "I'm going to my office." "Shouldn't you be in class?" "My father's taking your side now, are you feeling smug?" "Not particularly smug," Harry Osborne replied, exasperated. Why does she have to be so bloody sarcastic when she's angry, he wondered. Humph. Mary Jane Watson snorted, turning away again. Ignoring him, she strode towards the stairs. Her office was on the 15th floor, not too far, and the lift was crowded, so she opted for the stairs. The click-clack of her heels against the steps echoed sharply in the quiet stairwell. Mary Jane Watson couldn't quite pinpoint the source of her sudden anger, only a vague, unsettling frustration. She decided to blame it on the dressing down she'd just received from her father in his office. But the memory of his callous words, "I never planned on marrying you anyway," Someone said marriage is a tomb, and I'm not ready to die yet, stabbed at her, intensifying the ache in her chest. A wave of resentment washed over her, leaving her feeling utterly wretched. After a couple of steps, she glanced back. The man hadn't followed her after all, but stood at the bottom of the stairs, watching her. His expression was calm, unreadable, betraying no emotion. Bastard! As if I'd ever marry you. The sight of him, so seemingly composed after his calculated performance in front of her father, ignited her fury anew. The two-faced git, she muttered, before turning and hurrying up the stairs. Harry Osborn, having clearly heard her words, gave a wry smile, scratched his head, and turned towards the lift. He hadn't particularly wanted to visit her office anyway. He highly doubted she'd offer him the same fine tea as her father. Ah! A sudden scream echoed from above. Harry Osborn spun around. Mary Jane Watson, several flights up, had slipped. Her hands grasped for the railing, but missed. She tumbled down the stairs. The concrete steps were hard and unforgiving. A fall from that height could easily result in broken bones, or worse. Her face, pale with terror, was heading straight for the edge of a step. A direct impact could mean anything from facial scarring to severe head trauma, the consequences of which were unthinkable. For a moment, Harry Osborn was utterly stunned, his heart leaping into his throat, his mind a blank. In that instant, Harry Osborn couldn't hold back any longer, launching himself forward, his body a blur in the air, his movements impossible to follow. Seeing the woman's cheek and head about to collide with the sharp edge of the stairs, seeing her potentially suffer a grievous injury, a pair of hands finally caught her around the waist, another hand bracing her back and shoulder. Seeing that the woman hadn't fallen down the stairs and wasn't hurt, Harry Osborn breathed a sigh of relief. It was fortunate that, despite her snacking habit, she wasn't too heavy, holding her felt surprisingly light. Taking a long, shaky breath, he turned to look at the woman in his arms and froze. She seemed utterly terrified from the near miss, her face pale and bloodless, her body stiff, teeth clenched on her lower lip, her delicate nose wrinkled, eyes squeezed shut, long lashes trembling. Her face, etched with fear and terror, seemed on the verge of suffocating in that moment, only her eyelids flickering. Now, she bore no resemblance to the furious woman who had unjustly lashed out at him moments before, nor the elegant, composed teacher she presented to her students. Instead, she looked like a small, lost, and helpless woman. The top button of her blouse had come undone, and with a slight dip of his head, Harry Osborn could see the pale skin of her chest. Her heart hammered against him, a testament to her distress, making her seem even more vulnerable, stirring a strange protectiveness within him, a desire to hold her close, to soothe her helplessness and fear. Time seemed to stop completely in that moment. Harry Osborn held the woman tightly, her body fully against his, feeling her usually supple form now rigid, radiating warmth and trembling. A sudden surge of frustration welled up inside him. Although he'd spent nearly the entire previous day with this woman, even swatting her backside twice in anger, this was the first time he'd seen her at such close proximity. After all, this woman was his fiancée, the woman he'd been betrothed to since childhood. Looking at her panicked expression, her near suffocation from the sheer terror, a dull ache pulsed in his chest, his nose stinging. Feeling the warmth radiating from her, a strange thought arose within him, a desire to hold her close and cherish her. He now understood that even the most fiery and aggressive woman had a vulnerable side, a need for a strong shoulder to lean on. Yet, a persistent frustration simmered within him, a fire threatening to consume him. Damn it! This woman was so damn worrisome, even navigating stairs posed a danger. Mary Jane Watson remained motionless, trembling slightly, held tightly in his arms, eyes squeezed shut, as if still trapped in the grip of the extreme terror she'd just experienced. A full minute later, Mary Jane Watson slowly opened her eyes, only to find the familiar face of that bastard right before her, barely an inch from her nose, his eyes fixed on her with a mixture of conflicting emotions. Ah! Mary Jane Watson snapped back to reality in an instant, instinctively crying out as she wrenched herself from his embrace, shoving him away. Harry Osborn flinched, staring speechless at the easily startled woman, watching as her face flushed crimson, embarrassed as a ripe apple, tears welling in her eyes. What were you doing? What were you looking at? Before Harry Osborn could speak, Mary Jane Watson's expression darkened with a flicker of shame. Glaring at him, she snapped, "You still think you're right?" Harry Osborn's face turned grim in a flash. He looked at her darkly, unable to contain his outburst. Mary Jane Watson seemed intimidated by him, the anger and fierceness on her face softening as she stared blankly. "You're this old and still can't manage to walk down the stairs without falling." Harry Osborn's face darkened further, his voice hardening with barely suppressed fury as he glared at her. "I just wasn't being careful." Mary Jane Watson stammered, staring at him blankly, finally showing a hint of fear, yet still unwilling to back down, muttering under her breath. "Shut up." Harry Osborn seemed determined to lecture this careless woman today. Before she could finish, he roared, cutting her off. Mary Jane Watson didn't dare make another sound, staring blankly at the man before her, suddenly feeling like she didn't know him, surprised by how frightening he could be when angry. Despite this, she couldn't help but feel wronged. After all, she was his homeroom teacher, and he dared to yell at her like this. Wanting to retort, but not daring to, she could only glare at him, her lips moving as her face flushed even redder. "Mary Jane Watson, don't try to pull the teacher card on me today. This Harry Osborn isn't buying it." Harry Osborn's anger still simmered, recalling the dangerous moment, the near miss when she almost seriously injured herself. His heart pounded with lingering fear, and his fury blazed. "If you're ever this careless again, don't expect me to be polite. I don't want to spend every day by your side, constantly worrying about your safety. What's it to you?" At this, Mary Jane Watson couldn't hold back any longer. Tears streamed down her face as she gripped the railing, biting her lower lip, stubbornly yelling, her voice choked with emotion. "Next time, even if you beg me to care, I won't. But since we're stuck together for a year, you'd better behave yourself." Harry Osborn wasn't backing down either. He stepped closer, his cheek almost touching the tip of her nose, his voice a low growl, his throat bobbing, eyes bloodshot. "If something like this happens again, don't blame me for spanking that little bottom of yours." Perhaps even he didn't realize how much the near accident had rattled him, leaving him with a simmering frustration and nowhere to vent his anger. "You." At that moment, Mary Jane Watson's tears finally overflowed, streaming down her cheeks. Seemingly overwhelmed by the injustice of it all, she raised her small fists and pounded on Osborn's chest. "You jerk, why are you being so mean to me? What right do you have to control me? Who asked you to save me just now?" Harry Osborn's anger instantly extinguished as he stared at the woman, her aggrieved expression finally making him realize his outburst. The sight of tears welling in her eyes brought a pang of guilt to his heart. He remained rooted, allowing her to vent her fury. Her small fists pounded against his chest, but with her strength, it felt more like a tickle than a blow. "You jerk, always bossing me around. Do I need you to manage me? Who do you think you are?" Mary Jane Watson raged, tears streaming down her pale face. "What gives you the right to be so fierce with me? Just because my dad has your back doesn't make you so great." Harry Osborn stood motionless, a bitter taste in his mouth. After all, the woman had just been terrified, and her emotions were still raw. His scolding had naturally added to her distress. Yet, in this moment, he was surprised to find her usual arrogance and defiance gone. Hidden beneath her stubborn pride was a vulnerability that tugged at his heartstrings. He almost couldn't resist the urge to pull her into his arms and comfort her. His throat tightened, but he made no move. After what felt like an eternity, Mary Jane Watson's anger seemed to subside. Her movements slowed, and the color returned to her pale cheeks. She glared at him, tears still glistening on her face, and rasped, "From now on, stay out of my business. Even if I'm in danger, it's none of your concern." With that, she stubbornly dragged herself towards the stairs. Oof. After only 2 steps, she stumbled, nearly falling. A gasp escaped her lips, and fresh tears streamed down her face. Steadying herself against the railing, she continued her ascent, but with each step, the pain on her face intensified. Harry Osborn felt a pang of concern. He strode after her, grabbing her arm to stop her. He then bent down and, with a certain dominance, rolled up her trouser leg. Her smooth, jade-like calf was exposed, but it was her ankle that made him gasp and his face darken. It was already swollen and red, likely sprained. "Why didn't you say something about your ankle? Why are you so stubborn?" Harry Osborn looked up, his voice low and laced with anger, but more so with exasperation and heartache. "Does it matter to you?" Mary Jane Watson bit her lip, tears welling up again. She fought to hold them back, but her voice was still sharp with anger. "Of course it matters. You're my fiancée." Harry Osborn's face darkened again, his voice tight with frustration. "Who's your fiancée?" Mary Jane Watson blushed crimson, abruptly turning her head away. Harry Osborn, too lazy to argue, scooped her up without a word and strode upstairs. "Ah!" Mary Jane Watson's face paled with fright. She cried out, instinctively struggling. "You bastard! What are you doing? Put me down. Your foot's injured. How are you going to walk? Do you want to sit on the stairs all day?" Harry Osborn, unconcerned, tightened his grip on her shapely thighs, his other arm supporting her neck, and growled in frustration. "I told you, you don't need to worry about me," Mary Jane Watson pouted, furiously yelling and struggling to escape his grasp. But despite her struggles, Harry Osborn seemed determined. His arms held her like a vice. Her face grew even redder. "Bastard! Put me down," she shrieked. "If you don't want this foot anymore, if you want to rely on a wheelchair or crutches for the rest of your life, then go ahead and get down." Harry Osborn, exasperated by her restlessness, gritted his teeth. "You," Mary Jane Watson, seemingly intimidated, hissed, finally ceasing her struggles. Her blush deepened, like a ripe apple about to burst. Still indignant, her chest heaved, her teeth clenched, as she allowed him to carry her upstairs, her face turned away. But then, seemingly afraid of being seen carried like this by other teachers, she shivered and quickly wrapped her arms around his, burying her face in his chest. Harry Osborn watched her tense, blushing silence, a mixture of amusement and exasperation on his face. He knew exactly why she was so flustered, but said nothing, simply carrying her to her office on the 15th floor. He couldn't ignore the softness of her body, the springiness of her thighs, her jade-like hands gripping his neck, the faint fragrance emanating from her. A wave of desire washed over him. What captivated him most was her blushing face buried in his chest, a shy vulnerability that was utterly mesmerizing, irresistible to any man. Her demurely lowered head resembled a lotus flower swaying in the autumn breeze. Fortunately, perhaps because it was the first day of the new semester, most of the teachers on the 15th floor weren't in their offices. Mary Jane Watson didn't encounter anyone in the hallway, and finally breathed a sigh of relief. Mary Jane Watson's office, tucked away in the far corner of the building's top floor, wasn't spacious, but it was meticulously organized. As an economics professor who occasionally hosted academic guests, the office featured a sofa set in the center. Against the back wall stood a sturdy work desk and a genuine leather chair, piled high with teaching materials and economics journals. 2 potted plants, not the typical fortune-bringing variety, graced a corner, imbuing the office with a touch of life. Unexpectedly refined taste for a woman like her, Harry Osborn mused, retrieving her keys, unlocking the office, and carrying her inside. He gently placed her on the sofa. Mary Jane Watson, her tension easing, shot a conflicted look at the domineering man. She remained silent, still smarting from his earlier reprimand, and turned her head away with a huff. A nameless panic seized Mary Jane Watson as she recalled her surrender to his dominance, not only ceasing resistance but clinging to him, her face buried in his chest. Her heart pounded, her cheeks flushed crimson. Without a word, Harry Osborn crouched before her, removing her high heels and rolling up his suit trousers. He placed a hand on her sprained ankle. A strange sensation, mingled with the dull ache of her injury, sent a fresh wave of panic through Mary Jane Watson. She instinctively recoiled, pulling her foot away. "What are you doing?" she blurted. "Do you want to be hobbled all day?" Harry Osborn looked up, glaring at her, each word sharply enunciated. But it's not proper." Mary Jane Watson stammered, her blush deepening, still wary of his anger. "I'll be fine after a short rest," she mumbled, pouting. "Shut up." Harry Osborn snapped, gripping her ankle. "Are you always this chatty, Mary Jane Watson? Blabbering on and on. Call me lamb." Mary Jane Watson muttered, her voice barely a whisper. But before she could finish, his glare silenced her, the unspoken threat of his fury hanging in the air. Mary Jane Watson clamped her mouth shut, swallowing the last word. Even she was surprised by her lack of authority in his presence, a stark contrast to her usual confident demeanor as a teacher. Yet, instead of the expected indignation, a strange sweetness bloomed in her chest. Despite her crumbling composure, she refused to yield completely. Averting her gaze from his arrogant, demanding face, she continued to huff intermittently, her silent rebellion echoing in the room. At this moment, she felt the man's firm grip on her ankle, his fingers gently massaging. Surprisingly, the anticipated sharp pain never came. Instead, a warm current flowed from his fingertips, a soothing kneading sensation spreading a strange, stimulating pleasure throughout her body, bringing an unprecedented comfort. A little astonished, she hadn't expected such skill from him. The pressure was perfect, significantly easing the throbbing pain in her sprained ankle. Ever since learning about her engagement to the Osborn group heir, she'd held a negative impression of him, picturing a spoiled, dissolute playboy. Now, she unexpectedly discovered a delicate side beneath his domineering exterior. Slowly turning her head, she saw the swelling and bruising on her ankle noticeably reduced under his ministrations. A flicker of surprise crossed her face as she stared at him, momentarily stunned. The man remained crouched, carefully cradling her ankle, his fingers working with the gentle precision of an artist caressing a masterpiece. His expression, though still somber, held a focused intensity. For the first time, she truly observed him, realizing how different he was from the playboy image she'd conjured. His face, with its sharp angles, held no hint of impropriety as he held her leg, his eyes reflected concern and seriousness. She had to admit, his focused demeanor exuded an undeniable allure. A thought struck her, and she softly said, "Harry Osborn, you're actually a good man. I believe you'll find a woman much better than me someday." Harry Osborn's face darkened instantly. He snapped his head up, glaring at her with renewed anger blazing in his eyes. "I'm just being honest, why so fierce?" Mary Jane Watson, a little flustered, quickly lowered her gaze, muttering the words before falling silent. Harry Osborn sighed inwardly. The woman had finally quieted down, only to provoke him again, as if silence was unbearable. Ignoring her jab, he continued massaging her ankle for another 2 minutes before standing up, his tone serious. "Stay put in my office today. While it's better, don't walk around. Damaging a tendon would be troublesome. But I have things to do today." Mary Jane Watson whined, a hint of apprehension in her voice. "Even if the sky falls, you're staying here." Harry Osborn roared before she could finish, his knuckles cracking as he clenched his fists. Mary Jane Watson finally fell silent, but not without a disgruntled pout and a muttered, "What kind of student threatens their teacher like this?" Harry Osborn, ignoring her protests, scooped her up from the sofa and strode towards her desk. Ah! Mary Jane Watson's face paled in a flash of fear. She couldn't help but cry out, instinctively struggling. "You bastard! What are you doing?" Unfazed, Harry Osborn carried her the few steps to her desk and deposited her onto the leather chair. Then, in a domineering tone, he said, "I'm going out to get you some ointment. You stay put and behave. If I come back and you haven't been good, don't expect me to be nice." "And why should I?" Mary Jane Watson finally snapped. She felt a surge of indignation at his overbearing manner, especially given his audacity. Lifting her head, she retorted loudly. "Because I'm your fiancée." Harry Osborn shot back, equally irritated. "You," Mary Jane Watson was momentarily speechless. Glaring at him, eyes blazing, her chest heaving, she spat, "You think being a fiancé is some high-ranking official position? Besides, I'm your teacher. How dare you? I'm not going to argue with you. Just try acting up today and see what happens." Harry Osborn's face darkened. This woman was testing his patience. He roared, menace radiating from him. "I will act up. What are you going to do about it?" Mary Jane Watson was no pushover. Her anger flared, her eyes burning with fury as she glared back at him, ready to tear him apart. With that, she attempted to rise from the chair. Before she could move, Harry Osborn's expression hardened. He lunged forward, bracing his hands on the chair arms, his body leaning over her, trapping her in place. His face was inches from hers as he stared her down. Mary Jane Watson flushed crimson, instinctively shrinking back. She felt like a ripe apple about to burst, but trapped by his proximity, she couldn't retreat. His hot breath, tinged with the scent of tobacco, washed over her. Her head swam, and even breathing became difficult. A sudden fear gripped her. This man was terrifying. She felt like one wrong word would unleash his full fury. Yet, a strange shyness overcame her, replacing her usual defiance. In his presence, she felt flustered and powerless, unable to muster her usual resistance. What infuriated her even more was that this man was her student. "Mary Jane Watson, this is my last warning. You better behave yourself and stay put. Otherwise, you'll face the consequences." Harry Osborn lowered his voice, enunciating each word, "and stop threatening me with your teacher status. Even without Uncle Lamb's backing, I've never been afraid of you." With that, he finally stood up, released her, and strode over to a nearby bookshelf. He grabbed 2 random magazines and tossed them in front of her. "If you're bored, you can read. I'll be back shortly." He glared at her one last time before opening the office door and striding out. Chapter 39, The Oinking Hungry Pig finally released, Mary Jane Watson breathed a sigh of relief. Pressed against the chair by him moments before, she had distinctly smelled his masculine scent, her heart pounding almost to the point of suffocation. Her face flushed crimson with a mixture of shame and fury. Her thoughts were a tangled mess. Recalling his actions that day, and her own uncharacteristic submissiveness after nearly falling, she felt a fresh surge of anger. What she found even more unforgivable was her inability to assert her authority as a teacher, allowing herself to be bullied by a student to this extent. Unwilling to remain passively seated, she glanced nervously at the closed door. She considered standing up, but after a moment's hesitation, she angrily slumped back down, glaring at the door and hissing, "Insolent." She cursed the impudent, unruly student 81 times, wishing boils upon him, but her anger remained unquenched. Mary Jane Watson snatched a sheet of paper and a pencil, rapidly sketching a large pig's head. Crucially, the pig's face bore a slight resemblance to the offending student. Satisfied, she nodded, a triumphant smile spreading across her face. Still not feeling quite vindicated, she added a flurry of descriptive words, scribbling every insult she could conjure onto the page. As a final touch, she scrawled "Harry Osborn" across the pig's snout, finally content. She began to imagine him transformed into a pig, living under her roof, oinking and rolling around, its belly rumbling with hunger. Pfft! Unable to contain herself any longer, she burst into laughter, clutching her stomach as tears welled in her eyes. Her gaze gleamed with the cunning of a fox who had just executed a clever prank, her usual mischievous, defiant demeanor quickly returning. Lost in her fantasy of the hungry pig oinking incessantly, which she would pointedly refuse to feed, the doors suddenly swung open. Mary Jane Watson looked up sharply to see the pig-headed jerk had already returned from outside, one hand carrying a small plastic bag containing 2 tubes of ointment, the other a lunchbox. Seemingly, he'd even sorted out her lunch. Startled, she quickly crumpled the pig-headed sketch, clutched it tight, then grabbed a magazine, pretending to be engrossed in it. But after this performance, she felt exasperated and slightly ridiculous. Good heavens, what was she doing? She was his teacher, why was she so intimidated? With that thought, she slammed the magazine on the desk, her face a mask of barely contained fury, glaring at him, determined not to give the little bastard an inch. Harry Osborn locked the office door again, then turned to look at her. Seeing that she was still as angry as a lioness about to go berserk, he couldn't help but feel helpless. But seeing that she was still sitting obediently on the chair, his gloomy expression softened a little. Without a word, he squatted in front of her, pulled the ointment from the plastic bag, took her ankle, and carefully applied the medication. Mary Jane Watson tried to maintain her angry facade, but it crumbled. This time, she didn't struggle, just glared at him, chest heaving. Even she didn't understand her anger, only that this was the right face to present to this domineering thug. Right. Rest for an hour or two and you'll be fine. Harry Osborn straightened up, somewhat satisfied. I'll let you off this time, but if you're this careless again, don't expect me to be so lenient. Insolent. Mary Jane Watson glared, gritting her teeth, her face flushing again. It was nice to be cared for, but his smugness was infuriating. Ignoring her embarrassment and curses, Harry Osborn opened the lunchbox and placed it before her. You can't walk around today, so I got you lunch. You'd better eat it all. The food steamed invitingly. Why should I listen to you? Mary Jane Watson puffed her cheeks, frowned slightly, and muttered. Harry Osborn just shrugged, letting her words wash over him. He'd realized that expecting obedience from this woman was a pipe dream. If she didn't tear the house down, it was a good day. What puzzled him more was how such a restless, stubborn, hot-tempered, and unreasonable woman could be a respected teacher, a university professor, no less. Unable to solve this riddle, he rubbed his nose and said flatly, "Stay in the office this afternoon. I'll be checking in. If I find you gallivanting about, you'll regret it when we get home." With that said, he turned and walked out. Jerk. Mary Jane Watson cursed again, watching the scoundrel leave. She couldn't help but raise her fist, miming punching him in the head. However, the next turn of events left the haughty woman utterly dumbfounded, nearly sending her tumbling to the floor in a dizzy spell. Carried away by the moment, despite having just experienced this man's domineering and shameless behavior, she still wouldn't dare actually hit him. Imagining it, however, was harmless. So, she pictured slapping him, but unexpectedly, the pig-faced drawing she'd crumpled earlier flew from her hand. Mary Jane Watson watched, aghast, as the paper traced a perfect arc through the air, landing squarely on the back of the man's neck before rebounding with equal precision, settling on the floor in front of her desk. For a moment, Mary Jane Watson was completely stunned, heart pounding, frozen in place, unsure of what to do. At that very instant, Harry Osborn turned back, giving her a surprised look. He then noticed the crumpled paper on the floor and bent down to pick it up with a puzzled expression. "Ah, don't." Mary Jane Watson shrieked, nearly leaping from her chair to stop him, her face paling. But her frantic action startled Harry Osborn. Clutching the unopened paper, he rushed towards her without a word, pinning her to the chair by her shoulders. "Are you crazy? I told you to behave," he yelled. Mary Jane Watson, disregarding everything else, reached out to snatch the paper from his hand. "Give it to me. Give it back." Harry Osborn froze, staring at her, bewildered by her sudden agitation. But something was amiss. Ignoring everything else, he held the paper tight, refusing to return it, raising it high above his head, looking at her with a knowing smirk. The composed and gentle university professor was gone, replaced by a petulant child. "Give it back." Seeing Harry Osborn's deliberate provocation, Mary Jane Watson grew even more anxious. Pinned to the chair by him, she lunged forward, trying to grab his hand and snatch the paper. The next scene left them both speechless, frozen in place. In her fury, Mary Jane Watson, forgetting her dignity and composure, jumped from the chair, reaching for the paper held aloft. But the action threw her off balance, nearly sending her tumbling backward. Fear flashing across her face, she instinctively grabbed Harry Osborn's neck, her nose practically touching his cheek. Silence descended upon the office, a thick, suffocating quiet. Mary Jane Watson clung to Harry Osborn's neck, her body practically suspended from him, her flushed face inches from his. Harry Osborn, one hand on the chair's armrest, remained slightly bent over, letting her hold him. At this moment, a surge of restless energy coursed through Harry Osborn, a fire igniting in his gut as he gazed at the woman's face mere inches from his. His captivation intensified, one arm still frozen mid-air. The woman appeared equally stunned, her face a mixture of tension, a blush, and a hint of shyness. Her eyelashes fluttered, her rapid breaths releasing a warmth he could feel, a subtle fragrance he could smell. He noticed the redness of her earlobes. In that instant, Harry felt a jolt. This shy, seemingly distracted woman suddenly radiated a captivating softness, a potent allure. He felt an overwhelming urge to pull her close, to embrace her. Time seemed to freeze as they remained locked in this tableau, eyes wide, unmoving, their bodies seemingly unresponsive. Harry, unable to contain himself any longer, swallowed hard, his eyes reddening. A look of possessiveness washed over him as he leaned in, instinctively drawn to her cherry blossom lips. As his lips approached, Mary Jane Watson's eyes widened in alarm, the color draining from her face, replaced by a stark pallor. She seemed to struggle for breath. "Ack!" Mary Jane Watson snapped out of her stupor with a piercing shriek, her hands releasing their grip as she collapsed back onto the chair. But in the next moment, a furious energy took over. She grabbed his arm and sank her teeth into it. "You bastard!" she hissed. "Ack!" A squeal, like a stuck pig, echoed through the office. Harry, caught off guard, felt a searing pain shoot up his arm, nearly causing him to faint. Sweat beaded on his forehead. Snapping out of his daze, he glared at her, fury igniting within him. "What are you, some kind of rabid dog? Why the biting?" he yelled. "You deserved it. Who told you to try that stunt?" Mary Jane Watson retorted, her face pale, eyes blazing, teeth clenched, chest heaving. Her slightly parted lips suggested she hadn't quite finished with him. "You." Harry, exasperated, stared at her, speechless. "Bastard." Mary Jane Watson, still fuming, ground out the word, glaring at him, her face flushing again. Harry, seething, finally opted for silence. He had briefly glimpsed a captivating softness in her, but in a flash, she had reverted to her shrewish form, biting at the slightest provocation. Frustration welled up inside him. Glaring at her once more, he noticed the paper clutched in his hand, the very one she had been so desperately trying to grab. Curiosity piqued, he slowly unfolded it. One glance, and I almost choked on my spit. This woman's drawing skills are truly atrocious. A pig's head drawn this badly, and then seeing my name on the pig's snout with a bunch of descriptive words next to it. I don't know whether to laugh or cry. Give it back. Mary Jane Watson, noticing what I was doing, yelled again. But this time, I was ready. I tucked the paper into my shirt, then forced a smile and couldn't help but tease her. Since this is the portrait you drew for me, I'll reluctantly keep it. But I must say, your drawing skills need work, and your vocabulary is truly lacking. With that, ignoring Mary Jane Watson's furious glare, I turned and strode out of the office, finally unable to contain my grin. I really didn't expect that this woman, usually so stern in front of the students and so domineering towards me, would have such a cute side. Mary Jane Watson felt helpless, glaring angrily at my retreating back, her cheeks puffed out and face flushed, wanting to crawl into a hole. As I pulled open the office door to leave, I suddenly turned back, a familiar mischievous grin on my face. I said casually, "Oh yeah, the food I bought you, eat it while it's hot. I specially asked the cafeteria chef to make it for you because of your sprained ankle. Like cures like, you know." The words barely out, I vanished behind the closing door, which slammed shut with another resounding bang. That jerk! Mary Jane Watson instinctively cursed, then picked up the lunchbox in front of her. Inside, it was filled with fragrant braised pork trotters. Busy all morning, she was a bit hungry, and her stomach rumbled. That jerk at least had some conscience, bringing her lunch. But as she picked up a trotter to eat, something felt wrong. She kept replaying the jerk's words, like cures like. Why did he emphasize that phrase twice? If that's the logic, then eating trotters would heal. Harry Osborn. I'll kill you. 3 seconds later, a furious roar echoed through the office, followed by the crashing sounds of books and papers hurled against the door. Stepping out of the administration building, it was exactly 11:30 a.m., peak lunchtime for students. I was about to find something to eat when I saw John Watson, the school principal, exiting the building with a group of middle-aged men who looked like senior vice principals. They were probably heading to some fancy restaurant nearby for a lavish meal. That old fox, with his advanced age and shifty eyes, spotted me from afar. Without a word, he rushed over and dragged me along, insisting I join them for lunch. He said he wanted to introduce me to some of the school's teaching leaders, which would make things easier for me later on. For most folks, a lunch invitation from the head honcho would be a dream come true, but for Harry Osborn, it was a nightmare he dodged with a flimsy excuse. He had a bad feeling about the old fox, his over-the-top friendliness giving Harry the creeps, like he was angling for something shady. A quiet year at school was all Harry wanted, a way to appease his old man about the engagement. The school officials exchanged puzzled glances, wondering about the plainly dressed student, lacking the usual rich kid swagger, who'd prompted such a formal greeting from the usually stern Principal Watson. Adding to their confusion, the kid bolted, leaving Watson red-faced and embarrassed. Harry finally breathed easy once out of Watson's sight, but then his phone chirped. It was that weasel Eddie Brock. Harry pictured the gossipy, spineless Eddie, terrified of his own fierce sister, and chuckled, picking up the call. Eddie's call was an invitation to lunch, claiming they were now brothers, and Harry deserved a treat. Harry, unsure where to eat, figured a free lunch was a win, echoing Confucius's wisdom about the joy of a offered meal. Except, of course, from that old slyboots John Watson, whose enthusiasm nearly led to campus-wide posters announcing Harry as his future son-in-law. Chapter 41, the two campus belles. Eddie arrived at the agreed spot, sweating and looking even paler than usual. Harry saw through the act. It wasn't the run that tired him out, but standing by the podium all morning. Harry marveled that this teacher's pet, who'd flunked college entrance exams for 7 years and cheated his way into Tianfu University, was so meek. "Harry brother, everything all right after the principal's office?" Eddie asked, scanning Harry with unconcealed concern, showing a surprising bit of loyalty. Eddie was now officially Harry's self-proclaimed underling. What could happen? Harry scoffed. "You gotta know, disrespecting teachers is a major taboo here, and you went and pissed off Ms. Lamb in class like that." How'd you escape the principal's wrath? Eddie Brock, even more surprised, scratched his bird's nest of a hairdo, tilted his head, and muttered, "So, what did the principal want with you just now?" "I'm a newbie, but you know my sis is a third year here, so I've got some intel on the old man. Every opening day, he makes examples out of a few students, then lays down the law about Tianfu University's academic style. What if I told you that senile geezer's gone completely bonkers? He's taken a shine to my youthful brilliance and dashing good looks, and since he's got a kinda cute daughter, he wants me for a son-in-law. Believe it?" Harry Osborn touched his nose, a classic smirk spreading across his face as he spoke casually. "Nah, I don't buy it." Seeing Harry Osborn seemingly unscathed, Eddie Brock relaxed, sticking out his lip and giving him a sly once-over. He shook his head quickly. "Harry, my brother, I'm starting to think you're a real bullshitter, lost in your own little world of YY." Harry Osborn couldn't help but chuckle wryly. This world was just like that, the truth was often unbelievable. He decided not to argue with Eddie Brock. For lunch, Eddie Brock insisted on a swanky restaurant near the university gates, aiming for a quiet, elegant private room. But Harry Osborn vetoed that, opting for the university cafeteria instead. He never equated fancy, extravagant restaurants with good food, though he recognized that the scruffy guy in ripped jeans and chives stuck in his teeth across from him wasn't short on cash. In fact, he was probably loaded, way richer than the designer-clad posers who strutted around campus thinking they were hot stuff. After all, a person's upbringing and family background often instilled a confidence, generosity, and demeanor that was evident in their every word. The university had 5 cafeterias, the largest near the administration building. Yet, when Harry Osborn and Eddie Brock stepped through its doors, they were still taken aback. It was peak lunchtime, the vast hall packed with students eating at tables or queuing for food, a cacophony of noise filling the air. Thanks to Eddie Brock's fawning explanation, Harry Osborn learned that the cafeteria was divided into 3 tiers across 3 floors. The first floor offered standard fare at reasonable prices, catering mostly to students from modest backgrounds. The second floor housed specialty restaurants, with a more upscale ambience and menu, and offered à la carte options. Naturally, this attracted the more well-heeled students. The third floor was exclusively for faculty, off-limits to students. Eddie Brock insisted on eating on the second floor, and Harry Osborn didn't care. What he didn't expect was that the second floor would also be jam-packed, buzzing with activity. Tianfu University, a top 3 national university, sure lived up to its reputation, loaded with rich kids. Harry Osborn, rubbing his nose, couldn't help but sigh, then found an empty table in the far corner of the central hall and sat down. Scumbags are timeless. Max Dillon was one, and Eddie Brock is another. Without a word, Eddie pulled a series of sleazy moves, cutting to the front of the cafeteria line. Ignoring the complaints and glares, the indignant preppies rolling up their sleeves, he sweet-talked the lunch lady into a beaming smile, her face flushed as she ordered the cooks to prioritize his meal, adding, "Extra meat." Soon, the fuming but silent girls and the sleeve-rolling boys behind grew even angrier, glaring at the crow-haired guy in ripped jeans. Thankfully, no cafeteria riot broke out. Oblivious, Eddie, looking like he'd done this 1,000 times, returned with a tray piled with 4 delicate dishes and 2 bowls of rice. He plopped down opposite Harry, grinning, "Idiots. Trying to act all high and mighty in front of me. I bet those guys yelling the loudest were the ones who wanted to cut the line but were too chicken." Harry, still rubbing his nose, picked up his chopsticks and started eating. But after one bite, he noticed the smug bastard across from him suddenly lose his smirk. Eddie's eyes stared into the distance, his face a bizarre mix of emotions, mouth agape as if he'd swallowed 2 rotten duck eggs, mortified enough to want to crawl under the table, his face turning green. Harry, startled, followed Eddie's gaze and nearly choked on his own food. At a nearby table sat 2 beautiful women, daintily eating from 3 plates of stir-fried vegetables. One, around 21 or 22, had a soft, lovely figure, clad in tight jeans. About 5 feet 4 inches, with auburn curls and cute dimples on her fair cheeks, she wore a pale yellow t-shirt that hugged her figure, radiating a sweet, alluring charm. It was none other than Tiffany Brock, Eddie's lecherous sister and the university's third-ranked beauty. The other was Lilith Blackwood, today trading her red dress for baggy camo pants and a white off-the-shoulder t-shirt, revealing smooth white shoulders. Her long, black hair cascaded down her back, accentuating her stunning face, a blend of wild, fiery beauty with a touch of cool aloofness, making her seem untouchable. Eddie Brock wasn't wrong, these two women were indeed close classmates. They ate with refined grace, their quiet conversation punctuated by Tiffany Brock's captivating smiles and charming dimples. If Harry Osborn hadn't witnessed this little tigress's ferocity earlier that morning, he might have been fooled into thinking she was a sweet, gentle young lady. Other students in the dining hall noticed the two women. The sight of the university's two most popular beauties together was rare, sparking whispers and glances. Many male students gazed at them with admiration, itching to approach and impress them. However, everyone knew Lilith Blackwood was pursued by Victor Belmont, the cool student council president, and Tiffany Brock had a fiery temper, so no one dared make a move. Harry Osborn smirked, glancing at the male students' reactions. He couldn't help but chuckle inwardly. It was understandable for these hormone-driven guys to be captivated by beautiful women, but their hesitant cowardice was amusing. Chapter 42, The Battle Between Men and Tigress. Harry, brother, I just remembered, I have to study, gotta run. Eddie Brock cowered under the table, covering his face, a stark contrast to his earlier swagger while cutting in line. His forced smile was worse than crying. Harry Osborn remained silent, eating his meal and ignoring the lecherous Eddie. He couldn't believe Eddie was so terrified of his sister yet had the audacity to suggest setting Harry up with her. Eddie Brock abandoned any further thoughts of matchmaking, trying to sneak away. Just then, Tiffany Brock spotted them. Her expression changed, she slammed her chopsticks down, and darted towards them. Eddie Brock paled but, having been discovered, froze nervously. Well, living the high life, aren't we? Feasting with friends at noon, probably off to the bars to chase girls tonight, right? Tiffany Brock reached them, her anger replaced by a radiant smile and sparkling eyes, her dimples making her look like a seductive sprite. Yet, the sarcasm in her voice sent chills down their spines. Harry Osborn almost choked on his food, staring at her in bewildered amusement. He didn't even know this woman, yet she kept targeting him. She'd called him a bad person in class that morning, and now, after scolding Eddie Brock, she was insinuating things about him, feasting with friends. Looking up at her, he felt a moment of helplessness. Oh, so you don't agree when I call you a bad friend? The minute I saw you, I knew you weren't a good person. Tiffany Brock sneered, her tone dripping with disdain. Harry Osborn, who considered himself a calm and collected man, above such petty squabbles, finally snapped. Even a Buddha has a breaking point, and someone was deliberately provoking him. He set his chopsticks down, found a comfortable position, leaned back in his chair, crossed his legs, and looked directly at the small woman before him, a knowing smirk spreading across his face. Tiffany Brock plopped down next to Eddie Brock, arms crossed, her smile widening, eyes narrowing as she stared intently at Harry. She showed no sign of backing down, clearly ready for a confrontation. Eddie Brock, pale as a sheet, stood frozen beside them, a look of near panic on his face. He frantically winked at Harry Osborn, pleading with him to exercise restraint, terrified that his sister would demolish the cafeteria and cause a scene. Lilith Blackwood, sitting nearby, witnessed the exchange. Her eyes fixed on Harry Osborn, her face paled with barely contained fury. Remembering his offenses over the past 2 days, she felt the urge to dump her plate of food over his head. Harry Osborn had no time for Lilith Blackwood's anger. As long as she didn't provoke him, he preferred to maintain a policy of mutual non-interference. He kept his gaze locked on Tiffany Brock, a faint smile playing on his lips. Inwardly, however, he groaned. If she'd thrown a tantrum or stormed off, it would have been easier. But this petite woman was holding her ground, determined to challenge him. Her arms were crossed more comfortably, her smile 100 times brighter, her sparkling eyes 100 times more mocking than his. The cafeteria atmosphere became awkward and strange. The previous noise quieted considerably. The students, clearly enjoying the drama, had been watching the two beauties, and now gaped in astonishment. Tiffany Brock's reputation preceded her. She was known for being sharp-tongued and prone to violence, especially since she was the president of the university's Taekwondo club. Rumor had it that a guy who dared to stare at her one too many times ended up needing 3 bottles of liniment after she'd finished with him. Yet, this man before them, in a rumpled suit and messy hair, though handsome, exuded a certain poverty. That he dared provoke Tiffany Brock, the notorious violent beauty, was utterly earth-shattering in their eyes. Those more familiar with Tiffany Brock knew that her enchanting, strangely charming smile often presaged someone's misfortune. What chilled them further, yet filled them with gleeful anticipation, was that even Lilith Blackwood seemed intensely displeased with this impoverished student. Her icy glare from afar suggested a rage beyond measure. If looks could kill, he'd be mincemeat. Good heavens! Who was this character? He brazenly challenged 2 of the university's most celebrated beauties, neither of whom were easy to provoke, both notorious figures on campus, individuals typically avoided. The idle students, fueled by youthful exuberance, couldn't contain their buzzing whispers and pointing fingers. Mostly, they anticipated a good show, tinged with a strange sympathy for the audacious man. Eddie Brock, meanwhile, was in a complete panic. He knew his sister's temperament all too well. The brighter her smile, the greater the likelihood of an Osborne-level explosion. He dared not intervene, fearing he'd become collateral damage. Anxious, he paced in circles, tugging at his messy hair, on the verge of tears. The atmosphere grew bizarre, thick with tension, the air nearly solidifying. Harry Osborne remained casually seated, legs crossed, observing the petite but fierce girl with wide eyes and a subtly mocking smirk. His gaze held a hint of disdain. Tiffany Brock, equally unyielding, stared back without blinking, arms crossed, a radiant, coquettish smile on her face. Her eyes glittered like a predatory vixen's, her sweet cheeks and dimples like a blossoming lily. Her meaningful gaze and stubbornness sent shivers down the spines of onlookers. Tiffany Brock hadn't encountered many challengers in the past 2 years. This clueless fellow, clearly older than her wretched brother, was hiding among the freshmen. She pegged him as a delinquent who'd somehow stumbled into Tianfu University. This delinquent, old enough to be her uncle, dared to provoke her, the Taekwondo club president. To Tiffany Brock, this was an unforgivable offense, a crime of cosmic proportions. As time ticked by, neither yielded, locked in a staring contest, the air thick with tension. Tiffany Brock even contemplated whether to quarter the bastard or mince him into dog food for the roadside strays. But the next scene ignited a furious blaze within her, her blood boiling, rage taking complete control. The bastard across from her, his expression subtly shifting, those sly eyes finally breaking their gaze. Chapter 43, Harry Brothers' fury. Before Tiffany's anger could fully erupt, he clicked his tongue, a leer spreading across his face. Nice figure, good breeding stock, I reckon. In a flash, Tiffany Brock's smile vanished, replaced by a raging inferno. Her teeth gritted, her complexion shifting from flushed to ashen, eyes blazing, fury on the verge of eruption. Harry brother, careful. Eddie Brock blurted out in alarm, unable to contain himself. Before he could finish, Tiffany slammed her hand on the table with a resounding crack, jumped up, and roared, "You bastard!" She lunged across the table, reaching for Harry Osborne's collar, her other hand raised to strike, one foot stomping down on his instep. A deathly silence fell over the dining hall, everyone stunned by her roar, eyes wide, hearts pounding, watching the unfolding scene. Just as Tiffany's hand was about to connect with Osborne's head, and her high heel was about to crush his foot, the smile on Harry Osborne's face vanished, replaced by a grim scowl. With a swift movement, he dodged her stomp, caught her raised hand, rose from his seat, and without a word, scooped her up by the waist, hoisting her onto his shoulder. Tiffany shrieked, her face pale with fright. "You bastard, what are you doing?" Harry Osborne, his face grim, ignored her, carrying her out of the dining hall. Tiffany, terrified, her face drained of color, struggled with all her might to escape his grasp. But despite her struggles, the man's hand remained firmly clamped on her thigh, nullifying her taekwondo skills. His other hand smacked her backside, a sharp pop echoing through the air. "Bastard! I'll kill you! Let me go!" Tiffany Brock, humiliated and furious, thrashed with both arms and legs. Her long legs, trapped, couldn't move, but her hands were free, pummeling Osborne's back. Unfazed, Harry Osborne carried her out of the dining hall, quickly disappearing. Another slap landed on her rear. "Shut up," he snarled. "Don't think I'm scared of you just because others are. Campus queen. I'll still hit you if you piss me off." The dining hall fell silent, the only sound the thumping of hearts. Everyone stared, aghast, at the doorway, eyes wide with disbelief and shock. Who was this guy? He dared to hit Tiffany Brock, the infamous campus terror, and carry her off like that? In their eyes, Tiffany was untouchable. Now, this. They wondered if this plainly dressed man was crazy or just incredibly stupid. No one dared follow. The storm had broken, they didn't want to be on the receiving end of Tiffany's wrath. Curiosity was one thing, but inviting disaster was another. Eddie Brock's forehead pulsed with a vein, his already unpleasant face contorted in a grimace. He gaped at the doorway, speechless. It was over. Not just the dining hall, but the whole sky was about to fall. Eddie's blood ran cold. Only Lilith Blackwood seemed relatively calm, having witnessed the man's dominance yesterday. Still, she was taken aback. Anger simmered on her face, her knuckles white as she gripped her chopsticks. "You bastard," she muttered, "let's see how long your arrogance lasts. I, Lilith Blackwood, swear I won't let this go." Just as the whispers started, speculation about the man's identity and his impending doom, he strolled back into the dining hall. The darkness on his face vanished, replaced by an unnerving calm. His rumpled suit and messy hair shadowed his eyes, adding to his inscrutability. He shuffled in, shoulders slumped, head withdrawn into his collar, looking utterly ragged and somewhat pathetic. Upon entering, he ran a hand through his greasy hair, then wordlessly walked to his previous seat, plopped down with a resounding thud, and settled in with an air of nonchalance. His expression remained placid, as if nothing had happened, as if his doppelganger had committed the deed while he remained blissfully unaware. Eddie Brock gaped, staring at him as if he were an extraterrestrial being. His eyes bulged, his Adam's apple bobbed up and down as he swallowed hard, before stammering, Harry brother. Aren't you going to eat?" Harry Osborne abruptly lifted his head, glaring at Eddie Brock with disdain. He barked the question, kicking him under the table with one foot, then grabbed his chopsticks and began to shovel food into his mouth with gusto. He smacked his lips, grease smeared across his face, as if savoring a gourmet meal. This. Eddie Brock became even more bewildered, stuttering for a long time without managing a coherent sentence. Finally, he sat down uneasily, picked up his chopsticks, grabbed a piece of bok choy, and held it trembling in his hand, unable to bring it to his mouth. The students who had previously felt sympathy for him were now utterly astonished, staring as if he were a Martian. Good heavens, what kind of person was this? He dared to offend Tiffany Brock, carried her out of the dining hall, returned a short while later without any broken bones, no ambulance sirens wailing to whisk him off to the hospital, and yet, here he was, back safe and sound, his face as calm as if nothing had transpired. If it were anyone else, even if they hadn't been hospitalized, they'd be trembling and trying to make a run for it. This bloke was something else. He could still eat, and with such relish, too. Everyone was completely baffled, unsure what kind of deity he was. But one thing they knew for sure, today's events would cause an uproar throughout the entire university. Things would not be quiet again. Even Lilith Blackwood's feigned composure crumbled. She sat frozen in her chair, staring fixedly at the shabbily dressed man, unblinking. Just then, a commotion erupted from the floor below the dining hall. The startled crowd, jolted from their astonishment, suddenly remembered Tiffany Brock being carried away, only for him to return alone. Unable to contain their curiosity, everyone rushed to the balcony outside, looking down. They froze, speechless, eyes wide, staring at each other, eyeballs practically popping out of their sockets. Chapter 44, Please, take my sister. Tiffany Brock paced like a furious lioness, face flushed, one hand on her hip like a shrewish wife, the other pointing up at the second floor as she yelled, "You bastard, you scoundrel. If I don't kill you, I'm not a Brock. If you have the guts, don't use such underhanded tactics. Come down here and fight me one-on-one. I don't believe I can't teach you a lesson today. You damn bastard. You threatened to screw me senseless and make me have a bunch of kids. Come down here. If you don't screw me senseless today, I'll look down on you for the rest of my life." Who's afraid of who? Brother, what kind of friends are you making? He dared to bully your little sister right here. He even dared to touch my butt. Pacing back and forth, Tiffany fumed, her face a mask of rage and humiliation. She looked around wildly, as if searching for a brick, clearly tempted to bash the offending party's head in. A crowd of students gathered at the first-floor entrance of the dining hall, gawking at the normally violent Tiffany Brock's outburst. They whispered amongst themselves, speculating about who had the audacity to provoke her so spectacularly. Many began asking around, trying to piece together what had just transpired. After about 3 minutes of this, Tiffany seemed to tire of her tirade. Her voice, though hoarse, had quieted considerably. Having failed to locate a suitable brick, and apparently thinking better of physical assault, she shifted tactics. Her chest heaved, cheeks puffed out, and after a moment of indecision, she rounded on the onlookers and yelled, "What are you looking at? Never seen a beautiful woman lose her temper." With that, she stomped off, fists clenched, muttering, "So infuriating, so infuriating." The onlookers, especially those on the second floor who had witnessed the entire scene, exchanged bewildered glances. It seemed that the sun had indeed risen in the west, someone had crossed Tiffany Brock and emerged not only unscathed but seemingly victorious. All eyes turned to the object of Tiffany's wrath. The unflappable man had just finished his meal, setting down his chopsticks and casually wiping his mouth with a few napkins. He patted his full stomach contentedly and let out a satisfied burp. Leaning back in his chair, he crossed his legs and looked directly at the man sitting across from him, who appeared even more disheveled than himself. A faint smile played on his lips. Lilith was now certain, this man wasn't some hapless victim or accidental annoyance. He was a force to be reckoned with. To remain so calm, to eat so heartily in the face of Tiffany's fury, he was practically a god. The male students began to regard the man with a newfound respect, some even itching to swear blood brotherhood. The female students, eyes shining with admiration, looked ready to pounce, eager to claim this ruggedly handsome, if slightly shabby, man for themselves. Lilith Blackwood sighed inwardly. If yesterday's confrontation with this enigmatic man had been due to her own carelessness and his audacity, then witnessing Tiffany's spectacular defeat brought a sobering realization, this wasn't someone she could handle with brute force. At least for a bloke as audacious and aggressive, and as thick-skinned as him, even if Tiffany Brock and I joined forces, I'm afraid we'd only end up humiliating ourselves. Although Lilith Blackwood quickly grasped this, it didn't mean she could swallow yesterday's anger and easily let that bastard off the hook. After much deliberation, she finally shook her head helplessly, telling herself, "It seems that if I want to get even, I really can only play the long game, winning with strategy, not force." Harry Osborn, ignoring the whispers and curious glances of the surrounding students, pulled out a cigarette, tossed it to the still pale Eddie Brock sitting across from him, lit one for himself, took a deep drag, and exhaled a perfect smoke ring. Watching the smoke ring dissipate into the air, he glanced at the cowardly kid, only to see him with his head down, looking like he was about to be executed, on the verge of tears, his bowl of rice barely touched. Immediately unable to contain his contempt, he kicked Osborn under the table without a word. "Hey, can you act like a man? It's just your little sister, are you that scared?" "Harry, bro." Eddie Brock finally looked up, his face streaked with tears and snot, pathetically calling out, but unable to speak. Harry Osborn suddenly felt helpless. Although he himself was also shocked by Tiffany Brock's ferocity, this guy was still her older brother. Him being like a mouse in front of a cat when he saw her was just absurd. "You don't know, at home she's a completely obedient daughter. You know, when she acts cute in front of my parents, it's a critical hit, Osborn." Eddie Brock hung his head. "So, in front of my parents, they always think she's a well-behaved, obedient daughter. Plus, I'm not good at school and always cause trouble, like fighting, or accidentally seeing a girl changing and getting caught, so in comparison, I'm totally the black sheep of the Brock family, with basically no status at home." "Your trouble, was it really accidental?" Harry Osborn couldn't help but laugh, taking another drag of his cigarette as he asked. "Well, Eddie Brock's pale face suddenly flushed red, a bit embarrassed, and he quickly changed the subject. "Anyway, you can imagine, every time I piss her off, she runs to Dad and acts all sweet, then exaggerates everything, and the result is definitely a brutal beating for me. Harry, bro, you really don't know, I basically have no human rights at home." As he spoke, tears were about to fall. Harry Osborn smiled faintly. Now he understood. Cowards might all share the same cowardice, but behind that cowardice lay different circumstances. For example, Max Dillon is definitely way more Osborn than this guy. He's the absolute hellion of the Dillon family, always making Mr. Dillon and old Grandpa Dillon so mad their hair stands on end. And these past 2 days, my old man and mom are in the US for business, so she's become the emperor and overlord of the house. Every day I come home, I have to cook, wash dishes, and clean. Eddie Brock, seemingly oblivious to the contempt in Harry Osborn's eyes, continued to lament with his head down. "That's fine, I guess, who told her to be the good daughter and me the useless, bad son? But with my old man gone, if I even slightly disagree with her, she takes matters into her own hands, completely reverting to her true self. She's also the president of the school's taekwondo club. And then?" Harry Osborn's faint smile remained. "You've really stirred up a hornet's nest this time. I reckon she won't dare mess with you again for a while. But knowing her, after today's humiliation, she'll definitely seek revenge." Eddie Brock's face darkened, his brows knitting together like two furry caterpillars, resembling a condemned man awaiting execution. "So, ultimately, it's me who'll suffer the consequences, especially given our unusual relationship." Harry Osborn simply shrugged indifferently. This scoundrel lived this way, and yet still had the audacity to continue living. It was truly a minor miracle. It's just that at this moment, he seemed to have forgotten how he arrived at Tianfu University, how he became Mary Jane Watson's student. It was a classic case of the pot calling the kettle black. "I predict my house will be demolished tonight," Eddie Brock wailed, scratching his head vigorously. "Harry, brother, I'm begging you, just take my sister, make her your girlfriend, and discipline her properly. It's not for anything else, just to save me from this misery. Right now, it seems like only you can handle her, only you can tame her. You're dreaming. No way." Hearing this, Harry Osborn tensed up, startled, and waved his hands dismissively, rejecting the idea without a shred of hesitation. Empty words. Although he had just swallowed a bellyful of anger to pull off such a shocking act, he didn't want to provoke that tigress again. He still wanted a year of peace and quiet, not to be driven crazy by that woman. Besides, if he really found another girlfriend at school, and his old man found out, not being hung up and beaten would be the real miracle. Chapter 45, Every devil finds its match. Eddie Brock seemed even more determined in this thought, shamelessly pleading, almost on the verge of tears and snot, ready to kneel and kowtow to Harry Osborn. But Harry Osborn was resolute, determined to ignore this scoundrel. Good heavens, he'd never seen anyone beg someone else to take their sister as a girlfriend. Strange things happen every year, but this year was particularly abundant. In the end, Harry Osborn was completely exasperated. Without a word, he kicked the scoundrel in the shin, pretending to grab his collar and throw him off the second-floor balcony. Only then did the blasted fool finally shut up. Head hung low, he buried himself in a cigarette, quickly enveloping himself in a cloud of smoke and emanating a malevolent aura. But just then, a phone rang insistently. Eddie Brock immediately pulled out his phone, and with a single glance, his face paled, his body trembling, the cigarette almost slipping from his fingers. Harry Osborn, seeing his distressed state, almost burst out laughing. Looking at his expression, he knew it must be his little sister calling. Face flushed crimson, after much hesitation, he finally brought the phone to his ear with a trembling hand. Unexpectedly, an ear-splitting roar erupted from the other end. Eddie Brock, are you still with that jerk? Get down here, I'm waiting for you in the dining hall. Eddie Brock, startled, pulled the phone slightly away from his ear before cautiously replying, I'm busy, rather busy. Busy boozing and ogling chicks with that bastard. 10 seconds, get down here, or face the consequences. But before he could finish, a raw, guttural roar erupted from the other end, cutting him off before the line went dead. I'm screwed. Eddie Brock grimaced, muttering dejectedly, caught between a rock and a hard place, his face flushing crimson. Harry, bro, looks like I really gotta go. Coward. Harry Osborn curled his lip, scoffing without a shred of mercy. Harry, bro, you don't understand. Whenever she says, face the consequences are usually dire. Eddie Brock said with a wry smile, grinding his cigarette into the ground before springing to his feet and bolting. Harry Osborn, watching his friend's harried retreat, found it somewhat amusing. Good grief, it seemed like the three women he knew at this university were all forces to be reckoned with. Mary Jane Watson, his teacher, constantly wielded her authority to keep him in line, threatening to report him to his father if he stepped out of bounds. Quick-tempered and aloof, she was always threatening him with bodily harm. And then there was Tiffany Brock, an even bigger headache, a ferocious tigress, ready to bite at any moment. After much deliberation, he resigned himself to his fate. Where were all the gentle, refined ladies of yesteryear? Had times changed too quickly, or was he simply out of touch? Harry Osborn felt a headache coming on. He just wanted to keep his head down, get through the year, and appease his old man back home. May I sit here? Just as Harry Osborn was wrestling with these thoughts, a soft, melodious voice, clear as a wind chime, drifted to his ears, soothing his nerves. Startled, Harry Osborn whipped his head around. One look at the woman beside him and he nearly jumped out of his skin, almost tumbling under the table. Lilith Blackwood, seemingly materializing out of thin air, stood beside him with a gentle smile, a stark contrast to the fiery, aloof persona he remembered. She seemed to have transformed into the very picture of gentle femininity. Yet, in the glint of her eyes, Harry Osborn detected a hint of cunning, a sense that something wasn't quite right. He had to admit, though, her smile was captivating, and combined with her exquisite, porcelain-like face, it was enough to ensnare any ordinary man. But Harry Osborn knew better. This woman was no one's easy conquest. If she were a rose, she was most definitely one with thorns. Despite her alluring appearance, Harry Osborn wasn't about to give her an inch. "And what if I say no?" he retorted coldly. "Besides, I'm about to leave. Surely the illustrious Miss Blackwood wouldn't want to discuss with me the finer points of becoming a demure lady." "Brother." Lilith Blackwood's face darkened in a split second, her forced smile vanishing, replaced by a frigid, scowling expression. Her fists clenched, chest heaving, eyes blazing with fury. She seemed on the verge of exploding, ready to pummel him into the ground. But to Harry Osborn's surprise, within 3 short seconds, her rage subsided. The bland smile returned, though a cunning glint lingered in her eyes. Ignoring Harry Osborn's prior rejection, she gracefully sat beside him, pressing close, her arms wrapping around his. Harry Osborn stared, dumbfounded, as her ample bosom, whether intentionally or not, rubbed against his arm through her dress, sending a wave of soft, springy warmth through him, igniting a flicker of unwanted heat. Her smile broadened, her gaze adoring as she leaned into him, practically melting into his side. Harry Osborn could feel the pressure. This display of affection stunned the students in the hall. They gawked at Lilith Blackwood and the plainly dressed student, mouths agape, speechless. They were unaware that this icy beauty, with her prestigious background, hadn't been linked to a single male student in 3 years. Not even Victor Belmont, the student council president and the dreamboat of countless girls, had received a second glance from Lilith Blackwood. Yet here she was, acting like they were longtime lovers. The crowd was in shock. The incident with Tiffany Brock was still fresh in their minds, but this scene was like another thunderclap, leaving them dazed. Meanwhile, Harry Osborn was inwardly groaning, a tangled mess of misery. He had to admit, she was a breathtaking beauty, and her slightest touch was hard to resist. But he wasn't the type to be bowled over by every pretty face. He wasn't naive enough to believe she was head over heels for him just because he'd acted all Osborn-esque and dominant with Tiffany Brock earlier. Besides, based on what he knew of her, she wasn't the type to be easily swayed by any man. She was an independent spirit, a wild horse. He'd never considered himself to possess the kind of regal aura that made women swoon. Something was fishy. A jolt of alarm shot through Harry Osborn. He tried to stand, to escape her grasp, but her grip tightened. At that moment, he saw the calculating glint in her eyes, like a fox that had just caught its prey. Just then, a well-built young man entered through the main doors. He wore a perfectly tailored long coat, looked about 21 or 22, and had impeccably smooth skin. His handsome features, framed by tousled hair, gave him a ruggedly attractive air. What surprised Harry Osborn most were the young man's delicate hands, with long, scallion-like fingers, hands seemingly born for elegant tea ceremonies or piano concertos. A faint smile perpetually played on his lips, his eyes brimming with confidence and arrogance, yet his entire being exuded a depth and cunning far beyond his years. Trailing behind him were 2 other young men of similar age, likely underclassmen or student association subordinates. Decked out in designer clothes from head to toe, their demeanor suggested no ordinary background, yet they remained deferential to him, highlighting his importance. In an instant, Harry Osborn recognized the newcomer. His face darkened as he turned to glare at Lilith Blackwood. He finally understood the girl's devious intentions. "Ah, it's Victor Belmont." The dining hall erupted in excited squeals, numerous female students captivated, their eyes fixed on the young man as if eager to impress their Prince Charming. Damn it, he'd been used as a shield. Fury ignited within Harry Osborn. He tried to shake off Lilith Blackwood's grip, but she seemed to anticipate his move, clinging tighter, her body pressed against his. Ironically, this only amplified the romantic image projected to onlookers. "What's wrong? With a beauty like me by your side, you seem displeased." "I've never been intimate with any man, let alone had such close physical contact." "You should be honored." Lilith Blackwood blushed unexpectedly, but her smile grew even more mischievous. Leaning closer, she whispered, "You should also realize that, despite my usual aloofness, I can be gentle and docile like a little girl, can't I?" Lilith Blackwood. Harry Osborn snapped, his teeth gritted, the fire in his chest stoked to a raging inferno. Not out of fear, but simply because he wanted a peaceful year, free from the drama of the university's prominent figures. "Of course, you can consider this payback for yesterday. I, Lilith Blackwood, always keep my word. Anyone who crosses me will face retribution, and the method is entirely my prerogative." Her radiant smile vanished, replaced by a chilling intensity as she recalled his actions from the previous day. Whispering in his ear, she emphasized each word, "You should be honored. After all, being used as my shield, playing the role of my boyfriend, and incidentally deterring a few flies, I'm sure many would gladly accept this offer." "You." Harry Osborn could only fume in silence, his eyes blazing, unable to utter a word. Provocation, pure and simple. He couldn't believe a young lady from such a prominent background would resort to such shameless tactics for revenge. If she'd hired goons like yesterday, he wouldn't have cared. But this time, the woman wasn't just seeking revenge. She was deliberately pitting him against Victor Belmont, the influential student council president, while simultaneously shielding herself. A conspiracy, a bloody conspiracy. "Of course, if you apologize now for yesterday's incident, there's still time. I know Victor Belmont isn't someone to trifle with." Lilith Blackwood smirked at him, her usual coldness replaced by a demonic glint. "After 2 days of observation, I've realized you're no ordinary student. Dealing with Victor Belmont should be within your capabilities, right? If it gets too tough, you can always ask for my help." Lilith Blackwood, Harry Osborn gritted his teeth, utterly defeated. He finally realized he had underestimated this woman. Just then, the two young men trailing Victor Belmont spotted Harry Osborn and Lilith Blackwood sitting close, whispering intimately like lovers. They exchanged surprised glances, tugged at Victor Belmont's sleeve, and pointed in their direction. Victor Belmont followed their gaze, his face darkening momentarily before a faint smile appeared, his eyes turning icy. He approached them, stood beside them, and said softly, "Oh, Lilith, fancy seeing you here. What a coincidence." His gaze remained fixed on Harry Osborn. The ensuing scene left Harry Osborn utterly bewildered, unsure whether to laugh or cry. Lilith Blackwood, as if just noticing Victor Belmont's presence, looked up in feigned surprise, quickly released Harry Osborn's arm, shifted away, blushed dramatically, and shot him a gentle, reproachful glance. "It's all your fault. If you dare lay a hand on me again, I'll ignore you completely." Her demeanor, actions, and tone were perfectly that of a coy girlfriend caught with her boyfriend. Her flushed face, shy eyes, held no trace of anger, but rather the playful pout of a girl teasing her lover. Harry Osborn was speechless, utterly trapped. It seemed she was determined to use him as a shield, dragging him into a conflict with the formidable Victor Belmont. It was unbelievable that this cold, arrogant woman possessed such acting prowess. Forget outsiders, even he almost believed her coquettish act. She was wasting her talent not being a movie star. Witnessing this scene, Victor Belmont's expression soured. He stood frozen for 3 seconds before regaining his composure and politely inquiring, "Lilith, and this is?" "Oh, I forgot to introduce you." Lilith Blackwood's blush subsided as she replied seriously, "This is my close friend, Harry Osborn." She emphasized the words, "close friend," imbuing them with a subtle, ambiguous meaning. Victor Belmont simply chuckled, then extended his hand politely towards Harry Osborn with a suave gesture. "Hello, I'm Victor Belmont." Harry Osborn reluctantly shook his hand, saying nothing. He wasn't afraid of the student council president, but he was seething with resentment. "You two carry on. I have some business to attend to. I'll take my leave. Perhaps I'll treat you both to a meal sometime," Victor Belmont said politely, then turned and left the dining hall with his two companions. But the moment he turned, Harry Osborn's face hardened, his eyes darkening with a chilling coldness. He sighed inwardly, a sense of helplessness washing over him. Damn it, he just wanted a quiet, uneventful year at school, but he'd already managed to tangle with the most powerful person on campus. As Victor Belmont and his two friends disappeared from view, the seductive smile on Lilith Blackwood's face vanished, replaced by a chilling iciness, as if she transformed into a different person altogether. She released Harry's hand and abruptly stood up. Glaring at him furiously, she gritted her teeth. "Consider us even. You pissed me off yesterday, and I told you, anyone who messes with me, Lilith Blackwood, pays the price. I mean what I say." With that, she turned sharply, intending to leave the dining hall. But she'd only taken a single step when Harry Osborn blocked her path, his eyes glinting with mocking amusement, sharp and domineering. "What do you want?" Lilith Blackwood asked, a flicker of apprehension in her eyes, though she held his gaze defiantly, her voice low. "I think you've noticed, I hate being used. Not only did I just act as your shield, but I'm now caught in the crossfire. Don't you think you owe me some compensation?" Harry Osborn's voice was a low, cold drawl. "You're the type who exacts revenge, but I, Harry Osborn, am not someone you can use without consequence. What do you want? I'm warning you, if you try anything funny today, I won't let you get away with it." Lilith Blackwood seethed, her fists clenched, her eyes blazing with fury. Despite her repeated setbacks against him, her pride and stubbornness wouldn't allow her to submit easily. "I'd like to see you try," Harry Osborn said, the harmless smile fading from his face, replaced by a cold, hard anger. "I don't like being on the losing end. You just claimed to be my girlfriend in front of everyone. While I don't appreciate your fiery temper and was planning to steer clear, I have to admit, you're beautiful and alluring enough to drive any man crazy. You claim to be my girlfriend, shouldn't you fulfill the duties that come with it? You." Lilith Blackwood's fury intensified, her eyes practically spitting fire. "If you dare do anything reckless, I'll make sure you regret it. I'd like to see how you plan to make me regret it. I warned you not to test my patience, but you ignored me. Today, I'll make sure you learn your lesson." The faint smile on Harry Osborn's face vanished, replaced by a terrifying coldness. Without another word, he grabbed her hand and dragged her out of the dining hall. "What are you doing? Let me go." Lilith Blackwood shrieked, her face a mask of panicked fury. Her cries drew curious and surprised glances from those around them. She struggled, trying to pry his hand off with her free one, but Harry Osborn's grip was like iron, clamped tightly around her wrist. No matter how she thrashed, she couldn't break free. "Keep quiet if you don't want a repeat performance of our earlier intimacy in front of everyone," Harry Osborn said coldly, dragging her away without a glance, his voice dropping to a low murmur. "You bastard! If you dare cause a scene, I swear I'll kill you." Lilith Blackwood finally stopped shouting and struggling, but still seethed, refusing to back down. Knowing him, she fully believed he was capable of humiliating her publicly. If that happened, how could she possibly show her face at school again? Harry Osborn didn't reply, just continued dragging her downstairs and towards the parking lot near the dining hall where her Ferrari was parked. He pulled her to the car door and curtly ordered, "Open the door." "No way." Lilith Blackwood bit her lip, refusing. Panic clawed at her throat. If she opened the door, she couldn't be sure what he'd do. With the tinted windows, no one outside would see, and she might not even be able to call for help. She realized, with a sinking feeling, how reckless she'd been to provoke this man, regretting her impulsive act of revenge. "Open the car door." Harry Osborn glared, his voice sharp. "No," Lilith Blackwood gritted out, her expression unyielding. "Fine. A car door is nothing to me." Harry Osborn smirked, pulling a small piece of wire from his pocket. He began working on the lock while keeping a tight grip on her wrist, preventing her escape. What happened next stunned Lilith Blackwood. In less than 10 seconds, he'd opened the car. Good God, what kind of person was this? Her car had a top-of-the-line security system, yet he'd bypassed it with ease. Before she could react, Harry Osborn spun around, scooped her up, and deposited her in the back seat. He then climbed in after her and locked the doors. What are you doing? She was completely dumbfounded, her heart pounding in her chest. Her previous arrogance had vanished, the smugness from using him as a shield gone. She huddled in the corner, warily watching him. What do you think? A man and a woman in a car, what else could we do? Harry Osborn sneered, watching her evident fear. His anger finally began to subside. Damn it, if he didn't teach this girl a lesson today, she'd really think he was a pushover, someone she could use as she pleased.